When they finally broke down the sealed door in the Blackwood Mansion's basement, investigators found a room that had been untouched for 15 years. Inside were detailed financial records, photographs of prominent townspeople in compromising situations, and a diary that revealed why Margaret Blackwood had simply vanished from her bed one winter night, leaving behind only a single red rose and a town full of secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Margaret Blackwood had been the perfect banker's wife in Silver Creek, Montana, for 8 years before her mysterious disappearance in the winter of 1882. She was everything that frontier society expected from a woman of her station: gracious, charitable, soft-spoken, and completely devoted to supporting her husband's business and social ambitions. Every Tuesday, she hosted tea parties for the wives of Silver Creek's most prominent citizens. Every Sunday, she played organ at the Methodist Church. Every evening, she sat quietly in the parlor while her husband Charles discussed business with the men who controlled the economic and political life of the territory. What none of them realized was that Margaret Blackwood possessed one of the sharpest minds for financial analysis west of the Mississippi River, and that her apparent devotion to domestic duties was actually an elaborate cover for the most sophisticated intelligence operation in Montana Territory history. Behind her demure smile and gentle voice, Margaret was systematically documenting evidence of corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy that reached for the cattle ranches of Silver Creek all the way to the territorial capital and beyond. Margaret's transformation from sheltered Eastern socialite to frontier spy had begun shortly after her arrival in Silver Creek in 1874. She had married Charles Blackwood in Philadelphia, where she had been educated at one of the finest finishing schools for young ladies and had learned the social graces expected of a banker's wife. Charles had convinced her that their move to Montana Territory would be a romantic adventure, an opportunity to build something important together in the growing American West. But Margaret's romantic illusions about frontier life had been quickly shattered by the reality of what she discovered in Silver Creek. The town that Charles had described as a thriving community of honest farmers and hardworking miners was actually a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise controlled by a small group of wealthy men who used their legitimate businesses as covers for activities that ranged from simple fraud to outright murder. Margaret's awakening to the true nature of Silver Creek began during her first winter in town, when she witnessed what appeared to be a simple business transaction between her husband and a local cattle rancher named William Morrison. Morrison had come to the bank requesting a loan to expand his herd, and Charles had approved the loan after what seemed like routine negotiations. But Margaret, who had positioned herself in the adjoining room where she could overhear the conversation, realized that Morrison was actually using the loan to finance the purchase of stolen cattle from rustlers who operated throughout the territory. What made this discovery even more disturbing was Margaret's gradual realization that Charles was not an innocent victim of Morrison's deception, but an active participant in the scheme. Her husband, who had presented himself as an honest businessman committed to supporting legitimate economic development in the territory, was actually the financial coordinator for a criminal network that profited from cattle rustling, mining claim fraud, and political corruption. Margaret's initial response to these discoveries was a mixture of shock, anger, and fear that left her uncertain about how to proceed. She was hundreds of miles from her family in Philadelphia, completely dependent on Charles for her financial security, and living in a community where the normal legal and social institutions that might have protected her were controlled by the same criminals she had discovered. Reporting Charles and his associates to local law enforcement was impossible because the sheriff was clearly part of their operation. Contacting territorial authorities was equally dangerous because she had no way of knowing how far the corruption extended. The solution that Margaret ultimately developed was as brilliant as it was dangerous. If she couldn't safely expose the criminal network immediately, She would spend whatever time was necessary to gather comprehensive evidence that would be impossible to ignore or suppress. She would use her position as Charles's wife to gain access to information and documents that would be unavailable to outside investigators, and she would systematically build a case that could bring down the entire organization when the time was right. Margaret's intelligence operation began modestly, with careful observations of the conversations and meetings that took place in her home and its social gatherings throughout Silver Creek. She developed an extraordinary memory for details, training herself to recall entire conversations word for word and to notice discrepancies between what people said publicly and what they revealed in private moments. She also began to study the financial documents that Charles brought home from the bank, learning to interpret accounting records and legal papers that most women of her era would never have been expected to understand. As Margaret's skills developed, she became increasingly bold in her intelligence-gathering activities. She began making copies of important documents that passed through Charles's office, using her access to the bank after hours to photograph financial records and correspondence that revealed the scope and methods of the criminal network. She also started cultivating relationships with other women in Silver Creek whose husbands were involved in suspicious activities, using her reputation for discretion and sympathy to encourage them to share information about their domestic lives that often contained crucial intelligence about criminal operations. Margaret's most important breakthrough came when she discovered that Charles was maintaining two sets of financial records for the bank, one that was presented to territorial auditors and regulatory authorities, and another that documented the true nature of the bank's involvement in criminal activities. The legitimate records showed a modestly successful frontier bank that served the basic financial needs of local farmers and businesses. The secret records revealed that the bank was actually laundering money from cattle rustling operations, providing financing for illegal mining activities, and facilitating bribery payments to territorial officials. The discovery of the dual record system allowed Margaret to understand for the first time the true scope of the criminal network that had taken control of Silver Creek. Charles's bank was not just one corrupt business among many, but the financial center of an organization that controlled virtually every aspect of economic and political life in the territory. The network included not only the obvious criminals like cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, but also supposedly respectable businessmen, elected officials, and even clergymen who used their positions of trust to facilitate or conceal criminal activities. Margaret's documentation of the network's activities revealed connections between Silver Creek criminals and corrupt officials in the territorial capital, as well as relationships with criminal organizations in other Western territories and states. She discovered that stolen cattle from Montana were being sold in markets as far away as Chicago, that fraudulent mining claims were being used to attract investment from Eastern financiers who had no knowledge of the true situation, and that territorial political appointments were being bought and sold like commodities. As Margaret's intelligence operation expanded, she began to face increasingly serious personal risks that required her to develop sophisticated methods for protecting herself and her evidence. She created a hidden room in the basement of the Blackwood Mansion, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a false wall, where she could store documents and work on her investigations without fear of discovery. She also established secret communication channels with contacts outside of Silver Creek, including federal authorities and journalists who might eventually be able to use her evidence to expose the corruption. Margaret's hidden room became the nerve center of an intelligence operation that would have impressed professional government agents. She installed specialized equipment for copying and analyzing documents, created detailed maps showing the connections between different criminal operations, and maintained extensive files on every person involved in the network. Most importantly, she kept a detailed diary that recorded not only the evidence she had gathered, but also her analysis of how the various criminal activities were coordinated and financed. The psychological toll of Margaret's double life was enormous and constantly increasing. During the day, she had to maintain her facade as a devoted wife and prominent social figure, attending parties and church functions where she was surrounded by people she knew to be criminals. During the evening, she had to share a home and a bed with a husband whose illegal activities she was systematically documenting with the intention of eventually sending him to prison. The strain of constantly concealing her true feelings and activities began to affect her health and emotional stability in ways that became increasingly difficult to hide from the people around her. Margaret's situation became even more dangerous when she began to suspect that some members of the criminal network were becoming suspicious of her activities. Several times, she returned to her hidden room to find that documents had been moved or that equipment had been tampered with in ways that suggested someone else had been there. She also noticed that conversations would stop when she entered rooms, and that people who had previously been friendly toward her were beginning to treat her with caution and suspicion. The crisis that would ultimately lead to Margaret's disappearance began in November 1882, when she discovered evidence that the criminal network was planning to eliminate several people who posed threats to their operations. The evidence came from conversation between Charles and William Morrison that Margaret overheard while hiding in the basement of their home. The two men were discussing a list of individuals who had become problems that needed to be resolved before they could cause serious difficulties for the organization. Margaret was horrified to realize that one of the names on the list was that of a territorial investigator who had been asking questions about irregularities in Silver Creek's financial records. Another name belonged to a local rancher who had been refusing to cooperate with the cattle rustling operation and had threatened to contact federal authorities. Most terrifyingly, Margaret realized that her own name was also mentioned, though in terms that suggested the criminals were still uncertain about whether she posed a genuine threat to their security. The knowledge that she had been identified as a potential target forced Margaret to accelerate her plans for exposing the criminal network. She spent the next month working frantically to organize and copy the most important evidence she had gathered, preparing packages that could be sent to federal authorities, newspaper editors, and other contacts who might be able to act on her revelations. She also began making arrangements for her own escape from Silver Creek, though she knew that leaving would be extremely dangerous and might result in the destruction of evidence she hadn't yet been able to preserve. Margaret's final diary entry, written on December 15, 1882, revealed both her determination to complete her mission and her awareness that she was running out of time. She wrote, "I know they suspect me now. Charles has been asking questions about my activities, and Morrison has been watching the house. I've prepared everything I can, and the evidence is ready to be sent. If something happens to me, at least the truth will survive. These people have controlled this territory through fear and corruption for too long. Someone has to stop them, even if it costs everything." On the night of December 16th, 1882, Margaret Blackwood disappeared from her bedroom without a trace. Charles claimed to have discovered her absence when he woke the next morning, finding only a single red rose on her pillow and no indication of where she might have gone. A search of the house and surrounding area revealed no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no clues about what might have happened to the banker's wife who had been the picture of domestic contentment just hours before. The official investigation into Margaret's disappearance was conducted by Sheriff Tom Bradley, who was actually one of the corrupt officials whose activities Margaret had been documenting. Bradley's investigation was deliberately superficial and inconclusive, focusing on theories that Margaret had suffered mental breakdown or had run away with a secret lover. The possibility that she might have been murdered was mentioned only briefly and then dismissed due to the lack of physical evidence. The people of Silver Creek gradually accepted the official explanation that Margaret had simply left town voluntarily. though many found it difficult to believe that such a devoted wife and prominent community member would abandon her life without explanation. Charles played the role of the grieving husband convincingly, expressing bewilderment and sorrow about his wife's disappearance while privately working to ensure that no serious investigation would uncover the true circumstances of her fate. What actually happened to Margaret Blackwood remained a secret, known only to a small group of men who had decided that she posed too great a threat to their operations to be allowed to live. The decision to kill Margaret had been made during a private meeting between Charles, Morrison, Sheriff Bradley, and several other key figures in the criminal network. They had concluded that Margaret's intelligence activities were too sophisticated and comprehensive to be safely ignored, and that her elimination was necessary to protect the organization from exposure. Margaret's murder was carried out with the same careful planning that characterized all of the network's criminal activities. She was killed in her own bedroom by a person she trusted, using a method that left no obvious signs of violence. Her body was then removed from the house and disposed of in a location where it would never be found, while the scene was carefully arranged to suggest that she had left voluntarily. The red rose left on her pillow was intended as a signature, a message to anyone who might understand its significance that Margaret's fate had been sealed by her own investigative activities. The criminal network that Margaret had spent years documenting continued to operate successfully for more than a decade after her death, protected by the elimination of their most dangerous enemy and the destruction of the evidence she had been preparing to use against them. Charles Blackwood continued to serve as the organization's financial coordinator, managing money laundering operations and investment schemes that generated enormous profits for the network's leadership. Sheriff Bradley maintained the fiction that Margaret's disappearance remained an unsolved mystery, while ensuring that no serious investigations would threaten the organization's security. The eventual discovery of Margaret's hidden room came about through pure chance, rather than any systematic investigation into her disappearance. In 1897, 15 years after Margaret's death, the Blackwood Mansion was sold to a mining company that planned to convert it into offices for their expanding operations. During renovation work, construction workers discovered inconsistencies in the basement layout that led them to investigate the possibility of hidden spaces behind the walls. When the workers finally broke through the false wall that concealed Margaret's secret room, they found a treasure trove of evidence that had remained perfectly preserved for over a decade. Margaret's documentation of the criminal network's activities was so comprehensive and detailed that federal investigators were able to build cases against dozens of individuals within weeks of the discovery. The evidence included financial records that proved systematic fraud and money laundering, photographs that documented meetings between criminals and corrupt officials, and correspondence that revealed the network's connections to criminal organizations throughout the Western Territories. Most damning of all was Margaret's diary, which provided not only detailed accounts of criminal activities, but also her analysis of how the various operations were coordinated and financed. Her writing revealed the existence of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been systematically exploiting the resources and people of Montana Territory for nearly 2 decades. The diary also contained Margaret's predictions about how the network would evolve and expand, many of which had proven remarkably accurate in the years following her death. The federal investigation that followed the discovery of Margaret's evidence resulted in one of the largest criminal prosecutions in Montana Territory history. Charles Blackwood, William Morrison, Sheriff Bradley, and over 30 other individuals were arrested and charged with crimes ranging from fraud and conspiracy to murder and treason. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of the criminal network's activities and led to reforms in territorial law enforcement and financial regulation that helped prevent similar conspiracies from developing in other frontier regions. For the people of Silver Creek, the revelation of Margaret's true activities and the circumstances of her death created a profound sense of shock and guilt that affected the community for years to come. Many residents realized that they had unknowingly participated in or benefited from criminal activities, while others struggled to accept that the quiet, gentle woman they had known as a neighbor and friend had actually been one of the most effective law enforcement agents in the territory's history. Margaret's sacrifice ultimately served the cause of justice in ways that exceeded even her own expectations. The evidence she had gathered not only brought down the criminal network that had controlled Silver Creek, but also provided federal authorities with information that helped them investigate and prosecute similar organizations throughout the American West. Her documentation techniques and analytical methods became models for future investigations into organized crime and political corruption. The hidden room where Margaret had conducted her intelligence operations was preserved as a monument to her courage and dedication, though few people were ever allowed to visit the site due to security concerns. Federal authorities recognized that Margaret's work had been far more sophisticated and valuable than that of many professional investigators, and her methods were studied and adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Margaret Blackwood's story became a legend that inspired other women who found themselves in positions where they could gather intelligence about criminal activities. Her example demonstrated that even people who appeared powerless and vulnerable could make decisive contributions to the cause of justice if they were willing to accept the risks and make the sacrifices that such work required. The transformation of Margaret from sheltered socialite to a sophisticated intelligence operative illustrated the hidden potential that existed within many frontier women who were systematically underestimated by the criminal men who exploited their communities. Her ability to maintain her cover while conducting complex investigations showed that the social expectations and restrictions that limited women's public roles could actually be turned into advantages for those who possessed the intelligence and courage to use them effectively. Charles Blackwood was eventually executed for his role in Margaret's murder and his participation in the criminal network's other activities. Before his death, he provided a full confession that confirmed the details of Margaret's investigation and revealed additional information about the network's operations that had not been documented in her evidence. His final statement expressed regret for his criminal activities but showed no genuine remorse for his wife's murder, which he continued to justify as a necessary business decision. The red rose that had been left on Margaret's pillow was eventually identified as the signature of a professional assassin who had been hired by the criminal network to eliminate several of their enemies. The assassin, who had operated throughout the Western Territories for over a decade, was tracked down and arrested based on information contained in Margaret's files. His confession provided closure to the families of several other victims and helped federal authorities solve numerous unsolved murders throughout the region. Margaret's grave was never found, despite extensive searches conducted after the discovery of her evidence. Federal investigators believe that her body had been disposed of in one of the abandoned mine shafts that surrounded Silver Creek, but the exact location remained unknown. A memorial marker was placed in the Silver Creek Cemetery, bearing the inscription, Margaret Blackwood, 1850 to 1882. She gave her life to serve justice in the shadows. The impact of Margaret's work extended far beyond the prosecution of the criminals she had investigated. Her documentation of corruption in Montana Territory led to congressional investigations that resulted in major reforms in territorial administration and law enforcement. Federal authorities implemented new procedures for monitoring financial activities in frontier communities and established better communication systems that allowed local investigators to coordinate with territorial and federal officials. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story became a powerful reminder that courage and integrity could flourish even in the most corrupt and dangerous environments. Her willingness to risk everything to document and expose criminal activities inspired a new generation of investigators and reformers who continued her work of bringing justice to the American frontier. Her legacy lived on in the countless lives that were saved and the communities that were protected by the evidence she had gathered at the cost of her own life. The banker's wife, who had seemed so ordinary and unremarkable, had actually been one of the most extraordinary individuals in the history of the American West, a woman whose intelligence, courage, and dedication to justice had changed the course of territorial development and law enforcement. Her secret had indeed changed an entire town, and her influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Silver Creek to affect the development of the entire region. If you're enjoying these incredible true stories of hidden heroism and shocking secrets, hit that subscribe button because we've got many more tales of courage, mystery, and justice waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that in the Wild West, the most dangerous criminals often hid behind respectable facades, and that justice sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice from those brave enough to seek it.